Hi, everybody. My name is Ethan Du Bois, and this is my Restoration Ecology final exam. To begin, we're going to discuss the IPCC and their findings. This is an intergovernmental panel on climate change that consists of a group of about 250 authors that provide a report on the most recent findings in regards to climate change. This is a collaboration from authors throughout the world. Some of their key findings include the atmosphere and oceans have warmed since the 1950s, the amount of snow and ice have decreased since the 1950s, sea levels have risen since the 1950s, and the concentration of greenhouse gases have also risen since the 1950s. These changes make restoration ecology even more difficult. You may now have to consider what climate will be like 10, 20, 50 years from now on site. Maybe a species that you're intending to benefit now might not be able to exist based on conditions in the near future. So what can we expect in the future of climate? Warmer days and nights over most land area, more hot days and nights over most land areas. Frequency and duration of heat waves will increase. Increased frequency, intensity, and amount of heavy rainfall will also increase. Duration and intensity of drought will increase. Intensity of tropical cyclone activity will increase, and we can predict that we will experience sea level rise. So how do we cope? Assisted migration is one way, and this accounts for moving populations to different areas that may be suitable. This could save a species that's being moved, but it could be detrimental to the ecosystem they're being moved into. There's no guarantee that the relocated species will survive. And to account for some of this, you may need to move an entire set of populations to account for the whole ecosystem. Climate change will not be uniform. What is the right answer in one area may not be the right answer elsewhere. So that makes these decisions extremely difficult. Soils play a huge role in restoration ecology, and often plants are used to rehabilitate contaminated soils. Plants can provide nutrients that aren't available in the current systems like nitrogen and phosphorus. How do you restore the following conditions? Nutrient poor, you want to add organic amendments or compounds like sewage sludge, cow manure, and grass clippings. For nutrient-rich soils, you want to add material with high C to N ratios like oat straw or sawdust is a really good option. Contaminated soils with organic compounds, you want to clean up the soils. This can be done on or off site, but this is a really expensive method. You need dilution, separation, heat, or bioremediation. And contaminated soils with metal compounds, phytoremediation is typically done by plants, or you could excavate the soil and replace it. In today's world, we're dealing with a lot of situations where exotic, invasive, and pest species come into play. Exotic species are any non-native species. Invasive species are exotic species that have the ability to take over ecosystems and colonize new areas. And pest species can be either non-native or native, and they're just a species that disturbs a restoration. There's a huge economic gain from exotic species in general. And such a small percentage of those are invasive. So a native only approach doesn't make a ton of sense for us. Although invasive species makes it really difficult to deal with these situations sometimes. How do you know a species is a pest species? High population growth rates, well dispersed, good competitors, there's low control levels, there's a lack of predators, and they can prevail in disturbed areas. Herbicides can be a useful tool in eliminating all types of invasive pests and exotic species. However, that's when they're used correctly. When they're used incorrectly, they can have massive ramifications on ecosystems and either damage or deteriorate other populations within that system. Terrestrial restoration is a huge topic we covered, and we're going to be going over it in these next couple slides. Understory restoration includes three options: removal of shrubby, woody vegetation, prescribed burns, and mechanical thinning. Fire is an excellent tool for restoration, and in many types of ecosystems, it was constantly used historically to maintain the successional state of these systems. It removes plant species, litter, and sometimes even canopy species from these systems. These natural disturbances help maintain the conditions. Systems like longleaf pine in the southeast, North American grasslands, and African savannas are all examples of habitats that require fire. Grasslands, like I previously mentioned, are a huge piece of restoration, and to account for restoration in them, you need to remove invasive and pest species. You need seed drills, no-till or broadcast seed to introduce some of these grasses, and timing it plays a huge role. How do you know what plants to plant to use for your restoration? And this is a major question. And first, you want to think about the historical communities, the disturbance regime, successional stage, and soil on site. The species you choose should align with the goals of your project. You want to account for surrounding land use. You want to consider diversity and genetics, and you also want to think about the budget and the time frame, because some species are going to take a lot more time or be a lot more expensive and just not be plausible for your project. So there's pros and cons to seeds versus seedlings, and the choice really comes down to what type of goals and what resources you have on site for this project, and that's really going to depend on what you choose on that question. Arid lands is another type of ecosystem we went over, and there's three types of arid lands. You have hyperarid land, which is less than 100 millimeters of rainfall, no vegetation. You have arid zones, which is 100 to 300 millimeters of rainfall each year and some vegetation. And you have semi-arid zones, which are 300 to 800 millimeters of rainfall each summer and about 200 to 500 in the winter. This type of arid zone contains the most amount of vegetation in the three. Aridity is calculated by the amount of precipitation over the amount of potential evapotranspiration. Variables such as wind, solar radiation, and humidity affect this number. Threats to restoration in these systems include grazing, agriculture, roads, military activity, because they're often in the middle of nowhere where humans can't survive, and pollution. Ways people restore arid lands include closure, enclosure methods of grazing, soil stabilization, vegetation, soil manipulation, and seeding, as well as prescribed burns. Deserts are also a system we went over, and these are ecosystems that have little rain, wide fluctuations in temperature, really hot during the day, really cold during night, intense radiation, high winds, and low nutrient soils. Plants that occupy these systems have adapted to these conditions, and these adaptations include waiting for wet years to reproduce, so they'll only reproduce on years where they get a lot of rain, the ability to accumulate and store water, short life cycles to allow growth following rain events, deep roots, and smaller leaves and waxy coatings. Novel ecosystems are becoming more common, and these are urban areas that are impossible to return to pre-settlement conditions. Soils, vegetation, and hydrology have all been permanently changed on these sites. Isolation also plays a huge role, as they're often fragmented by large pieces of development and whatnot. So restoring these systems can be really difficult. There's a lack of trophic levels, decreased pollinators and seed dispersal, as well as stressful environments. Restoration that can be used to combat these are managing invasive species, attracting pollinators and herbivores through food, linking these areas as much as possible, and the use of stress-resistant plants. In these densely populated areas, you often see urban forests, and urban forests are parks made up of trees and grasses that require maintenance. Central parks are a really good example of this, and these systems can be restored by eliminating some of the management. You want to remove the mowing in some areas, establish an understory, and eliminate leaf raking. You kind of want to just let these systems become more natural. Socio ecosystems incorporate the social and economic aspects of these communities. So the system's no longer simply about wildlife. So you have to take into account what humans want, and maybe they don't want to see groundhogs being trapped out of that site, because a lot of people enjoy seeing groundhogs in the park, and they don't care about what it's disturbing. Soils within these areas also pose several challenges. There's severe compaction, lack of organic material and nutrients, contain debris, and they're often contaminated. Stormwater is also a problem. As you can see, urban conditions are not the best for restoration. But some ways you can control the stormwater problems is downspout disconnection, combined sewers, permeable pavement, bioswales, rain gardens, and green roofs. Over time, dams have become more abundant in our country, and they often impact ecosystems in a few ways. They impede the movement patterns of species, change water temperatures, they trap sediment, and they slow water movement throughout the systems. These systems can be restored by removing these dams, creating fish ladders, altering discharge, and digging new channels. Channelization poses additional difficulties which require digging new channels, recontouring the slopes, as well as stabilizing them. Problems within the watershed must also be addressed before you complete these actions. Succession occurs in all systems, not just forests. So attempting to control succession in streams and rivers is often time consuming and money and costing a lot of money. So you want to allow these stream systems to go through their streams, the stream successional stages. And we did a little math problem on stream classification, and I classified this stream as a C. 7 passive stream restoration techniques, and these include the adjustment of variables causing instability or loss of biological physical functions, change in land use management, change in riparian vegetation, flow modifications, flood control measures, road closures and stabilization, as well as hill slope erosion. There are several ways stream banks can be restored, and some of these include woody cuttings, fastens, brush mattresses, seeds with native grasses, plant tree saplings and container plants. You could use tree stumps and logs, geofabrics, erosion control matting, stone, and even fencing. And these ones I have listed here in blue are methods that do not require vegetation. Culverts are another method that were introduced by humans, and they pose a handful of issues, including physical blockages, velocity barriers, loss of habitat, and erosion. These problems can be solved by eliminating or removing these culverts, which account for some of by removing this culvert or replacing it with the one that accounts for the problems that is introduced. Oftentimes these culverts were put there and the thought process behind them wasn't really thought over, which creates these problems in the first place. In the next portion of class, we discuss wetlands and a site. To be considered a wetland, a site must contain the necessary hydrology, soils, and vegetation. These systems provide services that a lot of people don't even realize, including providing habitat, especially in regards to endangered species, flood peak reduction, groundwater replenishment, improvement of water quality, this is a huge one, storm protection, and carbon storage. As I mentioned previously, succession occurs in all types of systems. So succession in wetlands occurs basically as the system fills, soils raise, and ultimately it starts including different upland species. Events which hold these systems in the successional stage include drought, fire, and flooding. There are a handful of types of wetlands, and some of these include marshes, which are a type of wetland that includes herbaceous vegetation and are periodically saturated. Another type are swamps, which include trees and shrubs and have standing water in different times of the year. Both of these systems can be broken down into more specific types that we're going to get into. There are 8 types of marshes, which include freshwater marshes, wet meadows, wet prairies, prairie potholes, playas, vernal pools, freshwater tidal marshes, and saltwater tidal marshes. These various types vary in vegetation, development, and hydrologic influences. They all, however, remain saturated periodically and include herbaceous vegetation. There are 4 types of swamps: forested swamps, shrub swamps, mangrove swamps, and bogs and fens. These systems vary in vegetation composition, water type, regional location, and hydrologic influences. However, they all fit the definition of a swamp and contain trees and shrubs and include surface waters in different parts of the year. Restoration in wetlands can be difficult in some situations. Whenever you're restoring a wetland, pretty much you'll always need to make some adjustment to the hydrology. This can be done in several ways, including making modifications, installing a dike, and water control structure. These systems should be done before restoration begins, and this is kind of the kickoff to your project. Eventually, you'll need to revegetate these systems, and that can be done naturally by recolonization, You could supply seeds in different plants, or you could plant in zones, and this saves seeds and money. Some common problems that are often encountered when revegetating a wetland include where to plant and how to keep plants from drying out or drowning, which is drowning is actually the more likely piece in this system. Coastal ecosystems are actually something that's near and dear to my heart, as I've grown up in one, and these systems provide several ecosystem services, including storm protection, creating habitats for various organisms, economic relief, food and resources for humans, carbon sequestration, and they create increased tourism and recreation in these areas. Barrier islands are systems of long deposits of sand and sediment that occur offshore. These systems are constantly changing due to their nature. Waves, winds, and currents and tides create and shape these islands. These provide excellent habitat for bird, sea turtles, and fish. Restoration of barrier islands include vegetation planting, utilizing sand trap fencing, creating structure to protect the island from erosion, using dredge material to increase the dimensions of the site. And these activities are mainly to protect the barrier island from completely going underwater, based on the constant stress it's in from waves and wind. Sand dunes provide excellent services for humans. They create barriers that protect structures against storms and flooding. Unfortunately, these systems often need restoration. So to do this, you can create walkovers, the addition of dune vegetation, the addition of sand fences, and you can import more sand to make them bigger. These methods are used to restore and maintain dune conditions. Living shorelines are natural shorelines that have not been stabilized by hardened structures like bulkheads or riprap. Unfortunately, living shorelines are a lot less popular today than they were. These systems limit coastal erosion, improve water quality, and create habitats for various species. Salt marshes are a type of wetland that occurs between low and high tide. These systems are highly productive and they offer a variety of services. However, they face threats, including filling to make land for more development, ditching, diking, water flow modifications, and invasive species. And this is particularly threatening by the common reed, Phragmites. Today, the importance of these systems are acknowledged and efforts to protect them are more common. These include invasive control, reestablishing tidal hydrodynamics, removal of dredge material, plugging ditches, and installing breakwater to slow waves. Mangroves are another system that's extremely important. These provide services like slowing storm surge, reducing beach erosion, providing habitat for tons of wildlife, and carbon sequestration. 3 species of mangroves exist, all of which are adapted to life in coastal environments. These adaptations include excluding salt through filtration at the surface of the root, maturing quicker, different dispersal methods, and they have an arch that puts the roots above the water for increased support and protection. I think by now everyone in our country understands the problem we have with plastics in our ocean. Currently, we have islands made of plastics throughout our ocean, and these threaten fisheries and other wildlife. Not to mention, eventually these systems these pieces of plastic break into smaller pieces and create microplastics. And overall, we really don't know anything about microplastics and how they affect us, which is a worrisome thought. So how do we fix this? The simple answer is to use less plastics. And I think that's nice to say, but it's a lot more difficult to do. The complex answer is innovate. We have the power to create new technology, devices, and products which can help reduce the use of plastics and improve our situation somewhat. The ocean provides too many services to mention on a short slide, but some of these include oxygen, carbon sequestration, food, and other resources, and they're a huge stimulant of our economy. Systems within this ocean include oyster reefs, seagrasses, and coral reefs. They provide services such as water filtration, fish production, and storm protection. Oyster reefs face a tremendous amount of threats in today's world, including overharvest, increased sedimentation, pollution, disease, and invasive species. Restoration techniques to combat these include creating new habitats with suitable conditions, and this includes evaluating a variety of variables before restoration begins to figure out what you need and where you need to start. And this another piece of this includes promoting establishment with the use of hatcheries when needed. But in a perfect world, this would happen naturally, and they would recolonize themselves. Seagrass systems have been disrupted as much, if not more, than oyster reefs. These impacts have been created mainly by anthropogenic factors such as docks, marinas, navigation channels, and inexperienced boaters. To restore these communities, you must first improve water quality. That's first and foremost. An additional restoration includes planting and the use of sediment tubes where disruption has been left behind in these navigation boat paths and cuts that were created. Another big problem that people are becoming more familiar with is ocean acidification and coral bleaching. As CO2 increases in our oceans, pH decreases. This creates a more acidic ocean, which negatively impacts species like coral. These conditions, plus several additional stressors, lead to the loss of zooxanthellae, which in turn is what gives coral its vibrant colors to begin with. When they leave the coral, you see these famous bleaching events that now seem to be more and more common. Ocean acidification is an added stressor to this problem, but it's not the only culprit. So how do we restore these systems? Physical restoration of coral reefs is extremely expensive. These restoration projects include physical and biological aspects, or include biological and physical aspects of them. Methods include creating structure and topography in waters to use as substrates, coral nurseries offshore nearby the site, and you can also collect from one site and immediately deposit into your restoration site. And this is uncommon, but this would be ideal. And that's it. Thank you for a great class and a great semester, and I hope you have a great summer.